Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the NAAFA webinar series. I'm Tigress Osborne. I am the chair of the board and the director of community outreach for the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance. You've joined us today for part 3 in a 3-part webinar series that we've been hosting on the impacts of COVID-19 and the pandemic on fat community. Today, we are going to be joined by some very special guests from the NoBodyIsDisposable coalition. And today we are excited to say that we are also joined by ASL interpreters from Pro Bono ASL. So if you've been here with us before, you'll notice that I'm going to be working on speaking a little bit more slowly to make that easier for folks who need that in our audience and to make that easier for our ASL interpreters today. Thank you so much for being with us. Before I introduce the NoBodyIsDisposable folks, I just want to tell you a couple of important things that are coming up at NAAFA. If this is your first time experiencing NAAFA, we are a 52-year-old fat rights organization that has been working through education, advocacy, and support in the name of equality at every size. You can find out more information about what we're up to by following us on your favorite social media site, where we are at NAAFA Official, NAAFA OFFICIAL, or on Facebook, where you'll find us at facebook.com/equality at every size, or of course, on our own website, naafa.org. When you go to our website, you will see a couple of very special events that we have going on or coming up. First of all, we are in the final quarter of our first ever grant making program for fat community members to apply for mini grants up to $500 of funding to enable you to plan activities for fat community in your local area or online. Those applications are being accepted until April 30th, and you'll find them under the grant program on our website at naafa.org. So if you're seeing this live or you're seeing this on YouTube pretty soon after our recording date, you still have time to apply for one of those grants if you have a fantastic idea for supporting fat community. We also want to let you know that we are super excited to be producing our first ever Fat Liberation Month, which will happen in May of 2021, this May. We will be kicking off with a celebration event featuring angry fat people and DJ Bougie. And then we'll be following up with a tremendous amount of fun and educational programming throughout the month. And you can see our calendar and our confirmed so far participants and presenters and performers also at naafa.org under the Fat Liberation Month tab. So with no further ado, let me tell you about our very special guest today. The NoBodyIsDisposable coalition. Patty Byrne coined the expression "nobody is disposable." In 2017, she and activist Stacy Milburn shared analysis of disability justice, ableism, and disposability in a video series with Barnard Center for Research on Women as part of their work in the context of a group Sin's Invalid. In 2019, Max Airborne, who's with us today, reignited the phrase as the hashtag #NoBodyIsDisposable, NoBodyIsDisposable, along with Stacy Milburn and Don Haney in action with Fat Rose and Disability Justice Culture Club to bring fat and disability communities together to close the camps. In 2020, the hashtag #NoBodyIsDisposable campaign came together to resist triage discrimination during the COVID-19 pandemic. Fat Rose, the Fat Legal Advocacy, Rights, and Education Project, FLAIR, who you'll also be seeing in a webinar of their own during Fat Liberation Month, and one of whose members is here today with us, Brandy. The Independent Living Resource Center of San Francisco, Sin's Invalid, Disability Justice Culture Club, and others were part of this broad and building campaign, bringing people together, targeted by triage plans. For more information about the coalition, visit NoBodyIsDisposable.org. And now to introduce you to our individual panelists. Max Airborne, Key Kin, is a fat activist and artist Max co-founded Fat Rose in an effort to support a more radical fat liberation, one that addresses fat hatred as rooted in systems of domination, white supremacy, capitalism, colonialism, heteropatriarchy. Fat Rose also seeks to build relationships with other social justice movements, to bring fat liberation into the visions and platforms of the left. Max also founded Fat Lib Ink and co-founded Fat Girl Zine in the 90s. Welcome, Max. Fady Shenouda, he, him, is a SSHRC postdoctoral fellow at City University of London. His research examines the connections between international students' distress and the Western University as a key site for production and naturalization of colonialism. His scholarly contributions lie at the theoretical and pedagogical intersections of disability, MAD, and fat studies, and include socio-historical examinations that surface the interconnectedness of colonialism, racism, ableism, saneism, and fat phobia. He has published scholarly articles on disability and MAD-related issues in higher education, Canadian disability history and art, the anti-fat bias in medicine, and community-based learning. Dr. Shenouda is committed to research that simultaneously impacts academic thought and individuals in the community. To achieve this goal, he created and hosted the podcast, Disability Saves the World, which invites members of the disability, MAD, and fat communities to speak on their work and how they envision disability thought, activism, art, and how those things save the world. Welcome, Fady. Tracy Tidwell, she, her, is a multidisciplinary artist, activist, and cultural producer working in the folds of queer and disability arts community. She's co-editor of The Future is Fat, a book collection that examines understandings of time that allow for new expressions of fat experience, and creator of Fat Work, a photographic series that features fat women at work and explores fatness, class, race, and labor. Tracy is a core member of Fat Rose, Fat Liberation Cross-Movement Incubator, and works with the NoBodyIsDisposable Coalition, as you will hear about today. She's the project manager for Bodies in Transmission, Activist Art, Technology, and Access to Life, a disability arts and culture project at Revision, the Center for Art and Social Justice at the University of Gulf. Tracy? I'm sorry I didn't ask for the correct pronunciation of your university. Tracy, you'll fix that for me if I got it wrong, with my apologies. In all her work, Tracy explores how we are rooted in the past, present, and future, and centers process, connection, love, and queerness. Welcome, Tracy. And Brandy Senziak, she, her, is a queer, fat, legal, blind, disability, and immigration attorney. She is the legal director and the Fat Legal Advocacy Rights and Education Project with the Fat Legal Rights and Education Project, that's FLAIR. And she supervises the legal department at the Independent Living Resource Center, San Francisco. Brandy is also the supervising immigration attorney at the Homeless Advocacy Project, and her background is in criminal defense. She is a co-founder of the NoBodyIsDisposable Coalition. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. I know that was a lot of intros, audience, but I hope you feel as inspired hearing about these folks and their work as I did, and now we're going to hear about some very specific work of theirs. We're going to start today by asking each of our panelists to tell us, when did the COVID-19 or the coronavirus pandemic first come onto your radar? And how soon after that did you start thinking about the way it was going to affect you as a fat person and other people in fat community? Can we start with Max?
Sure. Hi. Let's see. I first started hearing about COVID in February of last year, before it really was on this continent. And then pretty quickly after that, it came here, and so we started realizing that we needed to organize. And I just looked back in my files and found together with folks from FLAIR, including Brandy, we put together this thing called a Fat Prepper's Guide to Survival During COVID. And that was like the first thing we did. And it was, we didn't know anything yet. We didn't know what was going to happen. We were just starting to see, little bits and pieces here and there. So we were kind of projecting onto what was happening, like how it was going to go for fat people. As we know, we can guess how things will go for fat people. So we started organizing there and put together that guide, really inspired by disability justice community because they were already doing that for disabled folks. Check.
I should also say for our guests that may not have seen us do this in previous webinars, one thing we're going to practice trying to do is say who we are before we speak. That makes it easier for our captioners and interpreters and transcribers. And so I'm Tigress, she, her. We won't say our pronouns out loud every time, but we will say our names as often as we remember. And of course, unless I, as the host, have just named you, you don't need to repeat your name in that case. Can we have Fady go next?
Hi, this is Fady. I heard about it also in February. I was in London at the time, and so the government's response there was to produce kind of herd immunity, which is quite terrifying. And immediately you could tell a sense of who would be impacted by COVID and who would essentially be dying if they did take on this approach. My personal concern was immediately about getting home, getting back to Toronto, and having spent anywhere between 5 to 10 hours trying to book a second seat on an airline, on an international flight to get home. I was particularly scared about how much it was going to cost me to get back home, whether I'd be able to book a second seat, whether that was something the airlines would allow me to do, given the number of people who were trying to get home. And so my fear was really about getting back to my people and getting there in a kind of a reasonable way. So it was very kind of personal in the first few weeks for me.
Thank you, Fady. Brandy, will you share your thoughts on that question next?
Yes, thank you, Tigress. So I first heard about it when we heard about Italy shutting down, and we started hearing stories in Italy about some fat people not receiving life-saving care when Italy's hospitals became too overcrowded. And we started getting very, very concerned that as COVID moved to the US, that the same thing would begin happening in the US, especially if different states issued crisis care guidelines that discriminated against providing life-saving care to fat people. And so we knew that this would have a really, really severe and disproportionate impact on Black and Brown communities. And we knew we had to do something right away. So, we started talking with each other and sort of figuring out a plan and what we were going to do to make a difference.
And in fact, you were, of course, right about that fear that states would do exactly that. And we'll get to that and your response to that in California and then later in Canada in just a minute. Tracy, will you finish off that question for us with your thoughts on that one?
Thanks, Tigress. Similarly, I started hearing about COVID in February and was worried right away. Once we started talking about it inside Fat Rose, of course, fat lives, disabled lives, Black and Brown lives were immediately on our minds and on our hearts. And pretty quickly, you all made the Fat Preppers Guide, which really started to inform my understanding of what was going on and what needed to get done. And in Toronto, there were concerns from disability scholars, activists, and legal folks pretty quickly around disability. And for me, that's always a bit of a guidepost as well. So I would say February, things started to get very real here.
thank you all for sort of grounding us in where things started. And now we're going to ask you to go a little bit chronologically, of course, jump in where things are relevant that may be out of the chronology, but to just tell our audience how you went from those individual concerns or personal concerns, community concerns, to the coming together of the Nobody is Disposable coalition. And Max, we'll have you start with the what was mentioned in your bio about some of the work that had been done in activism for fat and disabled folks before this coalition came together formally.
Thank you, Tigress. This is Max. So yeah, as you mentioned, in summer of 2019, Stacy Milburn and I got together and co-organized fat and disability communities together around closing the concentration camps at the border. And there was something that felt really unprecedented about it in terms of like fat and disability communities actually joining together to do an action. And then also that it was in solidarity with yet another community. And I really wanted us to use this phrase, nobody is disposable, because, you know, I just really need to lift up disability justice community and Sins Invalid as a founding incubator for disability justice. And, you know, that thinking has just so informed my thinking around fat and the ways that we need to organize. There's a beautiful poet and writer, Aurora Levins Morales, who talks beautifully in the Sins Invalid book that they've put out about the way that the body is the basis for a huge coalition. And I just really like keep that sentence in my mind and like, yeah, like, you know, we often organize in these ways where our struggles are siloed, right? Fat is like this siloed organizing work that we're doing. And often disability is too. And why are we not working together more? You know, why are Black and Brown communities siloed in their own struggles and disability and fat are treated as separate from that? Because all these communities overlap, you know, and it doesn't make sense that we're siloed. And so there's something about starting to shift our organizing to be more in coalition with each other that feels vital to me, to all of our survival. We need to care about each other's struggles. We need to recognize the way that all of these oppressions intersect in our bodies. And so Nobody is Disposable became the sort of organizing theme for this action in order to kind of recognize this unprecedented coming together of these struggles in an organizing principle. And so we did that, and then we did, as the fires were coming that fall in California, we kept using that phrase in different campaigns. There was this whole Power to Live campaign where we organized fat and disabled people together with Black and Brown communities fighting for utility justice. Like we all needed power, you know, electricity to survive, right? Many folks who use CPAP need power to survive. Folks who can't afford to refill their refrigerator after they get their power back, you know, organizing. So these communities coming together to organize. And so that was kind of why when we started organizing around COVID, you know, folks from Flare called me up and said, what are we going to do? How are we going to organize? And as we started talking about what work we wanted to do, it really felt like Nobody is Disposable was kind of a perfect organizing theme for COVID work too. Like, oh yeah, so many of us are at risk. When something disastrous happens, you really become aware of who is seen as disposable in our society. And that, you know, pretty much always includes fat people, always includes disabled people, always includes Black people, brown people, and poor people. You know, it's like, okay, we need to see these moments as reasons to come together and help each other survive. And so Nobody is Disposable really felt like the perfect way to start framing this work. So I'll say check there. Thank you.
Thanks, Max. And I think that Brandy is going to take it with the next stage.
Yes. Thank you, Max. That was really a great summary. So I wanted to kind of explain, once we did form as a coalition, we decided we wanted to take sort of a 3-step approach. We wanted to do advocacy and to inform, but we also wanted to inform people and provide, any tools and information that we had. So we decided that we would create an open letter, and we decided we would do a selfie campaign. And we also decided to create a toolkit with information in it regarding, hospitals that you could go to, certain cities that have laws protecting against discrimination based on weight and size, that had just like sort of helpful hints and helpful ideas about, creating language to say to doctors that you want life-saving care, or ways to, take a Sharpie to a hospital and write on your chest that you want, life-saving care. So we had just basically ideas that people could use if they so chose. And Max, are you willing to talk more about the open letter and the selfie campaign?
Yeah, so actually I was going to post a link to the open letter in the chat, so people could view it.
And
Yeah,
if you're watching this later, sorry to interrupt, Max, I'll just say, for those who are watching this later on YouTube, the links that we reference posting in the chat, we will also include in the caption on the YouTube video, so you can look at them there in the caption on the YouTube video.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is Max. So we talked about different ways that we could do campaigns, and what are the best ways to actually get people engaged around this issue and to raise the issue in the public. And so the open letter to care providers was an attempt to kind of appeal to care providers' sense of morality, basically, like, don't kill us. You will be tempted to let us go first, and you need to actually reconsider that. And here's why. And it was an interesting experience to see that a lot of care providers were actually signing on. And so just to like recognize care providers are in, they're in this weird land where the culture of, assumed hatred of certain bodies is really dominating the situation there. And they have, they're in a place of great moral responsibility to actually shift that. And they have the power to do that. That's a lot of power. And so, so we wrote this open letter to care providers. Over 2,000 people signed it. Many of them were care providers themselves. So that was really interesting. A lot of organizations and individuals signed on. And then we engaged other people doing a selfie campaign where we just asked people to sort of make their own signs on paper with like, nobody is disposable, and to say something about like why they didn't want to die and or how scared they were, or what they, who were they asking for support from, or and it was just beautiful. So many people took pictures because I think everybody was feeling really helpless. And so it was a nice way to kind of get people engaged and to feel a sense of community around their fear and struggle to survive. So yeah, it was really beautiful. Passing it back to you, Brandy.
Yeah, it was really beautiful. Brandy, can I just say one thing before you? First of all, I want to acknowledge, and something that Max said about how we need to be working more closely in solidarity with each other. I want to acknowledge the Fat Underground, which was an early Fat activist, radical feminist organization that put out a document called the Fat Manifesto, written by Judy Free Spirit and Alda Braun. And it very clearly states that we need to be, as Fat activists, in solidarity with other anti-oppression movements. And it really is, should be one of our guiding documents as people in the Fat liberation movement. It has not always been so from the organized Fat liberation movement, and especially, I will own this as the chair of NAAFA, from NAAFA. It has not always been so. But it is something that we as an organization are working on, and that we're seeing a lot more of from folks in Fat community, and that we really thank some of our other Fat organizations, including Fat Rose, for being inspiration for that. So I just want to acknowledge that history, and also that that longer ago history and that more recent history from Fat Rose. Thank you so much for that. And for those who haven't seen the social media campaign, hashtag NoBodyIsDisposable, it's really prominent still if you look at those hashtags, especially on Instagram. I know that Fat Rose reposted some people's photos, but also you can see things from people's own accounts all over, and you can still be using that hashtag. So I'm sorry for interrupting. Brandy, please jump back in where you were going to.
Oh, thank you, Tigress. With so many people, as Max said, engaging, it sort of, the toolkit sort of expanded, and we kept adding information as we received it in the toolkit. We started doing with DJCC, we did a sort of end of life planning, document planning workshop. And then we contacted traditional disability organizations and basically, talked to them and said, hey, like, this is what's going on. This is what we're doing. Let's work together. And so with DREDF, we did multiple Know Your Rights workshops where we sort of went through our toolkit. DREDF had their own toolkit, and, started those Know Your Rights workshops sort of led to Nobody Is Disposable working with the disability organizations, and we were invited to work with them in changing the guidelines. So basically what happened was California released their crisis care guidelines, and as we all feared, they were very discriminatory, and they discriminated based on people's weight, they discriminated based on people's age, they discriminated based on disability, and based on comorbidities. And so Nobody Is Disposable and Flare started working with DREDF and Disability Rights California and Justice and Aging in contacting the state and working with the state to amend those guidelines to make them not as discriminatory. And they went through multiple drafts of the guidelines, and it took multiple months, but finally we were able to get guidelines that were much, much better. They're not perfect, but they're much, much better. And I don't have the language up currently, sorry, but there is in the current California Crisis Care Guidelines, there's a section that's called Key Points, and it says that healthcare decisions cannot be based on disability, someone's conditions, including someone's weight, someone's size, immigration status, homeless status, socioeconomic status, use of past or future resources, and a whole list of other amazing characteristics that California was not going to be allowed to make crisis care decisions based on. And so we were very, very proud of those key points. And, we did see it as a success. And, we thanked the state in doing the right thing and finally working with community and disability groups in creating a much better document. So now I think we would like to switch to move to Tracy and Fady regarding what was going on in Canada with crisis care.
Thanks, Brandy. Fady, do you want to get us started, or?
Sure. Do you think it would help to maybe just do a little bit of context about Ontario. Yeah, just to give people a sense of where we're from in Ontario. So Ontario is one of the most populated provinces in Canada. There's about 14 million people living in Ontario versus the 37 million people who live in Canada. It's about 1.5 times the size of Texas. So it's a massive land that has to be covered. It's incredibly urban, as you know, as populated as Toronto is, and other parts of this, other parts in southern Ontario, but then also massive rural spaces in the north, where a whole host of Indigenous people live. Our healthcare system is provincial, and that's important because our current government is in fact conservative, even though the federal government is liberal. And we're essentially, at the whims of a Trump-light kind of leader currently. And so our healthcare system, funding of $1 billion in funding was cut to public health just before the pandemic. So there's been lots of different kind of things that have led us down to the path to where we are now, where essentially, there are 4,000 new cases today of COVID in Ontario. And maybe I'll just end by saying that although Ontario, the healthcare system here is of course free, nobody gets a bill at the end of their treatment. Long COVID is going to be very expensive for people who need things like massage therapy, occupational therapy, other forms of therapies to get back whatever they might want to in terms of their bodies, and there's no sense that that's going to be covered unless you have insurance. So that's kind of our context now. I'll hand it back to Tracy.
Thanks, Fady. I would add to that too that Ontario is currently in a crisis. We are mostly unvaccinated. The province has decided to offer one vaccine per person, and we're spreading our vaccines out by 103 or 105 days. And we're having a vaccine shortage. Vaccine clinics are canceling appointments and closing at the moment. We are in a third wave of COVID. Our ICUs are at the tipping point, quite literally. People are being flown out daily from urban centers to more rural hospitals to be in ICUs. We are in emergency care scenario. And the province first released its triage protocols in March of last year, and those were very alarming to disabled folks, older folks, fat people. The triage protocols incorporated the clinical frailty scale. I'm not sure if that's used in the US, but here in Canada, it's widely used across the country. And the clinical frailty scale is a text document. It also has kind of illustrated images of, it basically trains medical staff, especially doctors, on how to identify, how to assess who will receive triage care. Fady just connected us to that in the chat here. Thanks, Fady. And the images themselves are alarming. I think the newest version of the CFS includes 9 levels, and the first level is a masculine-like body running in his gym clothes, and then you kind of progressively move towards fatter, more hunched over, people using mobility devices, and it sort of moves from there. Once you get higher on the scale, the images become thinner, but they become more disabled. And so even just visually, there is this indication that fat, old, disabled lives are obviously less valuable according to the clinical frailty scale. And there was an immediate pushback by advocates, activists, legal, human rights lawyers, even some medical ethics organizations were just pushing back on that last March really quickly. And Fady, maybe you remember when they revoked that and have been working on new guidelines. As far as I know, they haven't yet released any new guidelines. However, we are in a moment where those policies and practices are in place. What I mean is they're being used. People are having to make decisions about who's getting triage, who's getting emergency care. And so we're in the thick of it. It's extraordinarily stressful. And I know from my work here in Toronto, I know from my work doing workshops with Nobody Is Disposable on the Know Your Rights last winter, and from a campaign that Fat Rose did as well, that fat and disabled people have been holed up in their homes. People have been avoiding going outside, knowing that our lives are considered disposable inside medicine. And so that has been sort of a big guiding post, I think, for me in terms of wanting to take the American toolkit and adapt it. And that's, Fady and I have known each other for a while, but that's where we came together on this project, was adapting what you all had produced in the US to an Ontario legal medical context. Neither of us are lawyers, but we really used that American toolkit as a guidepost to help us adapt it for this region. Fady, do you want to add anything to that?
Only just, this is Fady speaking, only that in the process of adapting it, you really do realize that in order to access the type of protection that one would need in the hospital is in fact that you do need kind of a legal degree, that there are barriers in the healthcare system that kind of replicate in the medical system, in the legal system, like getting a proper will, a power of attorney, a trust. There's all these different documentations that one needs, and they're incredibly expensive to get a lawyer to do. You can do them without a lawyer. And that we just found actually getting the right information, it took us a long time to put it together, to send it out with confidence. And of course, in the process, we always knew that we had no protection as fat people in Canada. There is no, discrimination is something that I think we experience, and there's no really legal framework to point to fat phobia except through disability, right? That's the only kind of legal framework. So fatness has to become disabling in order for it to become discriminatory. And as someone who, in London, I had literally just submitted a paper about the anti-fat bias in the medical, specifically about medical equipment, how, fat people, the medical equipment in Canada, MRIs, blood pressure cuffs, seating in hospitals, all those kinds of things do not imagine us as users of the healthcare system, right? And so you can imagine when it's an emergency situation, right? And they want to take my blood pressure, right? It's just like, where are they going to go? They don't have the equipment when it's not an emergency situation. So what are they going to do now? And it's kind of terrifying. And so the document was almost necessary. It was inevitable, as we've written more about this work. Yeah.
I want to just say quickly that if anyone, any listeners, any audience members are in Canada and do legal work, human rights work that is related to weight or size, contact us. We'd really love to be in touch with you, as I know would Brandy and Flair. And so be in touch if there's anybody out there who knows anything about anybody who's doing this work here.
Thanks, everyone. I think we're going to now talk about vaccine access and the work that Nobody Is Disposable has done towards that. Is that right? Are we ready to move on to that?
I think so.
And will that be Brandy?
Yes. Thank you, Tigress. So when we started hearing about the vaccines becoming available, we started paying very close attention again, because we were again concerned that fat people and disabled people and older people would probably not be prioritized. And, pretty early on, I think in December, maybe it was November or December, the state of California created a vaccine working group, which would be the folks writing and deciding the prioritization of vaccines. And they created a vaccine advisory committee to advise them. On the vaccine advisory committee were only, I believe there were upwards of 80 organizations. Only 3 of them were disabled organizations. None of them were disability justice organizations, and none of them were fat organizations. So we were very concerned. We contacted the same kind of lawyer and traditional disability organizations that we worked with the crisis care guidelines. Some of those folks had a seat at the table with the vaccine advisory committee. And basically we just started working with them. We knew that, the first iteration of vaccine priority was healthcare workers and people on the front lines. But we realized very quickly that fat people, disabled people, people with severe medical conditions, putting them at high risk for complications from COVID were, not in the first priority group or the second or the third. We were all the way down in category 1C. And eventually the state actually, continuously updated their prioritization, and they added people to category 1A, such as veterinarians. They didn't follow specific, the federal government actually stated that states should prioritize people over 65 and people with conditions that would put them at serious risk for COVID. And when that happened, California decided to take half of that suggestion and prioritize people 65 and over, and then decided that they would move to an completely age-based system after that, leaving people with disabilities, fat people, people with medical conditions that would put them at serious risk for complications from COVID, just sort of out altogether, which we knew would have a disproportionate impact on Black and Brown communities. And that wasn't okay with us. We knew we had to do something. So we, Nobody is Disposable, created a survey where we asked people to share their stories with us, people that had been staying in their home for more than a year now and not receiving and putting off serious medical procedures and medical testing because we were told that we couldn't go out of our home, that if we did go out of our home, we were at high risk of getting COVID. And if we did get COVID, we were likely at high risk of being discriminated against in a crisis care situation. And so we wanted to, collect these stories so that we would be able to share them with the vaccine advisory committee and also the vaccine working group. And we had hundreds of responses from people all over the country that had been putting off cancer treatment or cancer screenings or, physical therapy, that had been putting off treatments and care that were going to have, they could have life-changing consequences. And we actually started sending daily emails to the doctors that were on the working group, just to share these 3 or 4 people's stories every day and to explain to them why fat people and people with certain disabilities and people that were being, that had conditions that put them at high risk of serious complications from COVID needed to be prioritized. And, we finally did get priority. It was, for myself and for Flair, it was a little bittersweet because all the other groups that had been giving priority before us, the state would say, oh, okay, this group is going to be prioritized now. And it was sort of immediate. It took effect immediately. When they did decide to prioritize fat people, disabled people, people with certain medical conditions that put them at high risk for complications from COVID, they made that announcement on February 14th. But we were not actually given priority and able to start receiving the vaccine until March 15th. So that was, we were definitely happy to be given priority, but it was a little disappointing that we had to wait an additional month when we had all already been waiting more than a year, in our homes. So yeah, I think a lot of things came together when we were able to make that difference and get priority. And I think that, not only was it NBID and the survey and the stories and the emails that we were sending daily to the working group, but it was also DJL, Disability Justice League, who was doing public comments for basically almost every working group meeting, and having an organization signing on to those public comments, like NAAFA and Fat Rose and DJCC and Sins Invalid and lots of other amazing organizations. And it was, the work that a lot of disability justice organizations and fat justice organizations and, Fat Rose and everybody coming together, as Max had said in the past, and, how Tigress was talking about, us working together. And I think that was what made the difference. This morning, I was reading an article about vaccine in India. And I know Tracy has talked about the shortage of vaccine in Canada. And so although I, am very happy that we were able to get vaccine priority, it is, very disappointing to hear things such as, Canada and India having such shortages. And this article sort of stated that India had a huge shortage because they weren't able to receive some supplies from the US. And, now US has opened it up, not just to people with, high risk conditions of serious complications from COVID, but also to everybody over the age of 16. And so I just, want to put it out there that the work is not done, and we still all need to work together to, make sure everyone's vaccinated, not just people in the US, not just people in Canada, but everywhere. Check.
So I want to let our live audience who's with us know that we will have time for a few questions from the audience. If you want to put a question into the chat, we do ask you to type the word question in capital letters at the beginning of your question, so I know you're not just chatting amongst yourself, but have something you want me to ask our panelists. And before we start taking those questions, well, first I want to ask Brandy, if you made a distinction between disability rights groups and disability justice groups, and I'm not sure everybody in our audience knows what that distinction means. So I want to ask you to please clarify that. And then I just want to ask if any of the panelists have any thoughts they want to add before we open it up for questions, that they just go ahead and jump in with those thoughts, and then we'll take some questions from the audience.
Yes, absolutely. So when we're talking about disability justice, and we're talking about, we're talking about centering the most marginalized communities. We're talking about centering the needs of Black and brown, disabled, super fatties, like the most marginalized groups. Whereas I think traditional disability groups in the past haven't centered, Black and brown people. They haven't centered the most disabled people or the fattest people. They've sort of centered the white person with, I'm blind, and they would probably center me as the white person that has what they quote unquote the good disability of being visually impaired. Those are the people that traditional disability groups have traditionally centered. So we're trying to, I think it's very important that traditional disability groups also work with disability justice groups and follow, disability justice principles, which there's 10 disability justice principles that you can find on the Sins Invalid website. And yeah, it's very important that we all work together and center the most marginalized communities.
Brandy, thanks for clarifying that for us. And panelists, do you have anything you want to jump in with before we start taking questions?
Yeah, thanks, Tigress. Thanks, Brandy. I just wanted to say that I don't think Fady or I mentioned that Ontario did prioritize some fat people in phase 2, which we're semi still in at the moment. Our vaccine rollout has been very disintegrated, so it's hard to exactly know what's happening. It's more open now. If you're younger and want AstraZeneca, supplies are short. Phase 2 is high priority groups. So some fat people have been vaccinated because of their fatness in phase 2, and it depended on a BMI marker of 40 or higher, although the province had earlier marked BMI 30 or higher as high risk. So there's discrepancy and confusion there on the part of our vaccine rollout and clarity around what's happening. And then separately, I wanted to say that I think it's really important for us to acknowledge how what is happening here and what we're describing is part of the modern legacy of eugenics and betterment thinking, and leaving behind and disposing of bodies and people who our cultures and societies and medicine believe have less meaningful or valuable lives. And I know that the term eugenic comes up in our campaigns, but it hasn't come up here today. And I just wanted to make sure that we said that, because that's part of what's happening here. Check.
Thanks, Tracy. And anyone else? Okay, I don't see any of our panelists saying, let me jump back in. So I'm gonna pose a question. If you, would you all talk a little bit about how you think this work influenced people in other parts of the US or in other parts of the world? We know that the California work influenced the Canada work. What did you hear from people in fat community about how it influenced them in other places? And any of you can unmute and jump in if you have a response to that question.
I would say this is Brandy, sorry. I would say we were contacted by people in other states and people in other places that were very interested in the toolkit and in, the work that NBID was doing. And I think they had questions. A lot of people just sort of wanted to ask, like, how we came together and what we did. And so we would, kind of just share our experience and share a lot of what we've shared here today with folks. And I think that in some places it's led to folks trying to also advocate in these ways. Check.
And I'll just add to that question for our panelists. Is there any specific advice you would like to give for people who would like to pick up this work wherever they are?
This is Fady. Maybe I'll just jump in with a little bit of an anecdote. I was on Twitter a couple of days ago and I saw from an ICU doctor, they made a comment about how there was a 2-page narrative written by the patient's wife about who this person was in the bed, who, what they did, who their family was. And the ICU doctor, in this tweet made a comment about, like, this is great. I wish all my patients had this. And, you know, that's part of the kind of survival techniques, survival strategies that is part of the toolkit, right? Tell them who you are so you matter, right? So you're no longer disposable to them. So you're not just a body, but actually a human being who has, you know, capacities and desires. And no, we shouldn't be asking people to demonstrate their worth and value to a doctor, right? Their humanity, essentially, in order for them to be provided care. And I guess to answer your question, Tigress, it's that it seems like we actually do have to do that, right? So if you are going to do anything, right, if you are going to go to the hospital, if you are going to have to interact with the medical community in some way, it may be this document, this 2-page narrative about your worth and value that you might want to put together or have someone put together for you.
Thank you for that example, Fady. I will say that in the early days when the Fat Preppers Guide came out and Fat Rose was doing some of those workshops, and I think the NoBodyIsDisposable Coalition was helping with some of those workshops about getting, like, in the event that something happens to you. I remember being a participant in one of those workshops and in our breakout room talking about what it meant to hear this advice that we could, you know, there was a suggestion that you put sort of like a clear sheet cover, paper sheet cover around your neck, and inside of it, a paper that had a photo of you and people you love, and maybe some details about you that would humanize you if you were unable to communicate verbally with medical personnel. And I remember we spent our entire time in the breakout room talking about how emotional it was, like how meaningful it was to have that specific advice to do this thing that could be potentially life-saving, and how devastating it was to know that we lived in bodies that meant that we had to do that. I remember that, like, I'm getting emotional just talking about that workshop a year ago, right? Because that is part of our fat lives. And so that is why the work that you all have been doing has been so important. And thank you for that example, Fady. I saw that in your Instagram stories and I got mad too. Does anyone else want to give any specific advice for folks who may want to do this activism in other places?
I know that when I got inspired to adapt and I got in touch with Nobody Is Disposable, many of whom I work with through Fat Rose already, and Flair and others, to ask if that would be okay. They were so supportive of just allowing us to run with the structure and even some of the language, and really adapt it to our context. And that was really meaningful. It felt really supportive, and it felt like a way to extend the really radical work that was happening in the US and in California to other places. I also am aware that it's not a similar toolkit, but there was some kind of document released out of the UK as well by an activist, Kay. I forget Kay's last name right now. Max, maybe you know Kay's name, but I think who does social work and activism, and like, I know that there are some sort of interconnected resource-driven, community-based work happening, and I just wanted to acknowledge how generative that was to be connected and to be supporting each other in the work that we were doing. So I guess the advice that would come from that is to be in touch. We will share resources. We will show up for you. And I would also say that it's really intense to have to advocate for actions and strategies that will both save our lives and, as you pointed out, Tigress, like, also undo us, also make us come face to face with the truth of how our bodies are seen and how disposable our bodies are understood to be. And so both things are really important to do. Like, we do want to live. And so just sort of making space for the intensity is definitely some advice I would give. Check.
Can I speak a little bit to that also? I feel like I want to, this is Max. I want to just also lift up mutual aid and building community who can support each other. Because we're here, we are talking about work against this huge system that has so much power, and we can make little dents, maybe, and we can go through these dehumanizing experiences of trying to humanize ourselves to a doctor. And I think another piece of that medicine that we need is each other. We need a community of people who understand what we're going through, who are going through it themselves, maybe, who can help support each other. I mean, during COVID, we've had at different points friends bringing us food, or we're making food for other people. And just like these ways of, staying in touch with each other and supporting each other through this stuff, because, it's going to take us a long time to actually make meaningful change in the government. We can keep trying, but, and I'm remembering at one of those Know Your Rights workshops, someone basically saying, these tools, like, who are these tools for? These are tools for white people. It's like, yeah, I mean, when the system hasn't worked for you ever, why would you think that appealing to the system is the meaningful way to go? It's like, no, I rely on my people, my people who actually will have my back. And so I think while we work to change these systems, we also need to be working to continue nurturing and building the community who will actually have our back, regardless of what the state is doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Max. I'll add a moment of personal testimony there too. Like, the practical mutual aid is so important, but also the emotional support that has come from Fat community and disability justice community and all of those organizations working together, but also individual people who are not part of this sort of organized resistance. Just that emotional support from Fat community was, I can say I've witnessed it for others, and I've experienced it personally when I had COVID myself, that some of the greatest outpouring of just emotional support came from folks in Fat community. And it's because we know the risk, and it's because people in Fat community were more afraid for me, because they knew the risks if something happened to me as a fat, brown, unemployed, child free, all the things, right? And so just having that intersectional lens amongst so many of the folks in our activist community was a tremendous support to me, and I've seen it for others. And I'm just I'm grateful, and I'm also encouraging all of you, if you're not a person who wants to get involved at a sort of activist level, that mutual aid level and mutual support level is just a great way for you to lend your support. There's a question from the chat. What are additional ways or opportunities that Canada-based and US-based intersectional activists can join forces, especially to promote vaccine equity from a worldwide perspective? Does anyone have thoughts on that?
I don't know. I love this question, Sandra, and I thank you. And I really want to have a conversation with you about it, because I know you well enough to know that if you're asking a question, that you probably have some really generative thoughts around it, and want to have good, chew on it together. I will say that I'm partner. My girlfriend of forever studies politics and teaches politics and global politics. And I don't know much about this, but I do know that vaccine nationalism is, Brandy mentioned India, it's a big problem, and we are living it here. And in some respects, the US is living it with its mass excesses of vaccines at the moment. My partner's sister was walking through Target and was being offered vaccines, and they were, nobody was even taking them because everybody was vaccinated already. And that antidote, just next to the fact that I know clinics are closing regularly here and people are desperately scouring every place they can just to find a first vaccine. It is a stark contrast. In terms of how we can keep working together, I'd like to talk more about that.
I feel, this is Max, I feel like that really highlights how much more we could be and need to be focusing on anti-imperialism and making connections with people all over the world. We're so centered here on this continent in our work. And the politics and governments coming from this continent, particularly the United States, have such a huge impact on the world. And that needs to be part of our framework.
And I should say we don't have a lot of examples globally that we are aware of, but I do want to give a shout out to the We for Fat Rights organization. And I want to thank our speaker from our last webinar episode, Dr. Kat Pazé, for raising our awareness of their work. I had heard of that organization, but I didn't know that they were doing specifically work around fat rights and COVID-19 and medical access. And so I just want to give them a shout out. You can see more information about them at fatrights.org. And we will look into featuring them some other way through our NAAFA channels because we did not have them here today. So I just want to acknowledge their work. And if folks know other people who are doing that work, please do let us know so we can help highlight the work that they're doing in other places around the country. So I will ask one more specific question before we go with our sort of wrap up question. And I want to go back to something that Max said earlier in the webinar. I believe it was Max, and he said something about the support that you saw from care providers. And I think we have not focused on that a lot in thinking about activism, but it is really important to acknowledge their role. What did you all hear from care providers about the work that you were doing? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
This is Max. I actually have a number of friends personally who are nurses and nurse practitioners who were kind of giving me anecdotes from their work and also talking about like what's the best way to approach the care guidelines or the triage guidelines, you know, because they were saying to me how powerless they feel, you know, like these guidelines come down and it's the hospital creating their own guidelines, you know, kind of off in some room somewhere and giving nurses these numbers and, you know, here's the algorithm. Basically, they create an algorithm based on these SOFA scores. The SOFA stands for like survival in organ failure or something like that. It's similar to the frailty scale that Tracy was talking about. I think it's like this idea of how healthy you are. So these algorithms get created by the hospitals and they just get passed down to the frontline nurses. And the nurse, the person I'm closest to who's a nurse said that they felt like the way to encourage care providers and what they were trying to do is actually to push back against the hospital, for the nurses to actually like push back against the hospital administration and their you know, guidelines that they were creating, which may or may not have been based on state guidelines. That was the other thing. It's like hospitals get to kind of create their own sort of taking in under advisement these state guidelines, but not necessarily following them. You know, they're kind of on their own, and doesn't seem like there's a lot of accountability there. So the nurses are saying, you know, actually push back against the hospital administration. that's what they wanted to encourage nurses to do. And so that sort of helped inform our care provider letter, was this advice from a care provider, that, oh, no, to help nurses understand that they can push back against the hospital administration. And so I thought that was really interesting. And that's, a nurse putting themselves at a lot of risk. And the nurse that I was talking to is part of a union, which I think really helps, so they feel more empowered to speak out. But yeah, really encouraging care providers to speak out. And many of them want to, particularly nurses.
Thank you for adding that, Max. This is Brandy. I just wanted to, go off of a little bit of what Max was talking about. So since hospitals get to create their own crisis care guidelines, and some of them may or may not be following the state guidelines, I think that one sort of advocacy tool that individuals could use if you found yourself in a crisis care situation is to, maybe print out the state guidelines or be able to show the hospital the state guidelines. But to also, if this happens to you or someone please reach out to us at FLAIR, or reach out to us at NBID, or reach out to DREDF or Disability Rights California, because all of us are, if we hear of this happening, we want to do what we can to advocate for those for individuals, and to try to get the hospital to follow the state guidelines. Check.
So I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up today's webinar. And before we have our panelists share their final thoughts, I want to once again thank you all on behalf of the NAAFA board and the Future of NAAFA Committee for joining us today for part 3 of our COVID webinar series. If you missed the other 2 parts, you can always see them on our YouTube channel at NAAFA Official on YouTube. And part 1 featured Deshawn Harrison and Reagan Chastain discussing the sociocultural impacts of the virus on things like fat hatred and diet culture. And part 2 featured Dr. Kat Pausé talking about the ways that that as a public health expert, she and her colleagues were able to trace how anti-fatness showed up in the scapegoating of fat people in government policies and in media coverage. And then, of course, this episode is also available on YouTube for folks later. We are able to provide these webinars free to fat community and other fat positive folks through the generous contributions of our NAAFA members and supporters. If that is something you would like to support, please go to naafa.org/join donate, and you can make contributions specifically towards the webinar program or for any of our general programming. It helps us with all of the educational and support and advocacy work that we do. And there is a special line item for making a donation to the work of FLAIR if you're particularly interested in justice and legal rights. So what we always wrap up with our guests by asking if there's anything that we did not ask you specifically that you just really want to make sure gets said about this subject, or that our audience knows about this subject. And I'll just ask one of you to go first and then name the next person who will go. And before you give your answer, would you please let folks know how they can find you if you would like them to be able to follow you personally as an activist, in addition to following the work of Nobody is Disposable.
Maybe I'll start just because part of what I want to say is also to thank everybody else in the room for kind of all of their work. Brandy and Max putting this together, Tracy for, reaching out and for then, okaying me, helping her in writing this and in doing the kind of bare minimum. I guess what the question I would want is, like, if you want to get involved, please do, because this community is like open and willing and wants to collaborate with people and wants the different perspectives and is clearly transnational and wants to be intersectional. And I think to me that that is a very powerful thing to desire, right? Like more people, more interaction, more community. And so I've only found it to be wonderful. And I think I was telling this to Tracy, that the first time preparing for this conversation is the first time I was ever in a room with only other fat people. That had never happened before. And so I didn't think that I would have such an effect, but it really did. It's like, it means something, we're not even sharing space, but it meant something terribly to me to be in community with people who I understand no explanation is necessary. And you can find me on my website, fadyshinuda.com. Thanks.
Thanks, Fady. Will you hand it off to one of the other panelists? And can I ask each of you to do that as we wrap up? Sure, I'm gonna pass it to Tracy.
Thanks, Fady. It's been great working with you and with all of you. And I don't have anything else I want to add except also my thanks to NAAFA, to Tigress for this webinar series, for all the work that you're doing to also do cross-movement organizing, Tigress, within NAAFA. It's really powerful, and it's really felt and noticed, and great things are happening because of it. And I want to acknowledge everyone in Nobody is Disposable who got this incredible work happening. And of course, my people in Fat Rose, who are just a grounding spot for me and my fat activism at this moment in time. And Max and also Don Haney for being our founding members. That's it for me. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to pass it to Brandy.
Thank you, Tracy. I agree with Tracy. I want to thank everyone so much for all of the work. It's, been really amazing all of us working together. And yeah, thank Fat Rose and DJL and everybody that's put in so much time with NBID. There's definitely a lot of moving parts and a lot of people that have contributed to all of our work and everything that has happened, and that NBID has produced, and the changes that we've made. So thank you to everyone. And I did want to add and remind folks that, like, if you are doing this type of work, to remember to do advocacy and work with a disability justice framework, and really center the most marginalized communities. And if you want to contact me, you can contact me at my first name, Brandy, BRANDIE, at flareproject.org. That's my email address. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, NAAFA and Tigress and everyone for putting this together today. And I will send it to Max.
Thank you, Brandy. This is Max. Wow, all the thanks that have gone around, I completely echo everything. And I really want to encourage folks to look up disability justice and learn about it. It's, disability justice emerged as, in many ways, a reaction to disability rights. Disability rights have been doing its thing, fighting for people's rights. And some Black and brown and queer folks of color really, they got together and talked about how disability rights left them out. And that in order to really not leave out folks who are actually the most marginalized, you needed to actually look intersectionally. You needed to look at class. You need to look at the ways that other systems, not just the system of ableism, but other systems are working to oppress people. And so how do we look at all of that in a more holistic picture? And I think that that is, what's going to kind of save us as a movement, is if we really start doing that, really start looking at the ways that the different oppressive dominant systems are connected. That feels like the bottom line foundation of the work that we need to do. And so, yeah, I feel like that feels like the backdrop, for all of this. And I mean, because this is NAAFA, I'll also say here that I just feel really wonderful about the way that this work is really part of kind of filling out the sort of ecology of the fat liberation movement, right? It's like, okay, so we have work going on here and here and here, and like, how can we actually fill that out and not have it just be about one thing, but think about fat cultural work, fat political work, the ways that we're connecting with other movements, like all of this stuff actually working together. And each of us working on different things that weave together to create the whole ecology of our movement. I feel like that's really growing. And I really give thanks to Fat Rose and the incubation space that it has provided for us starting to do this kind of work, for me starting to do this kind of work. And yeah, I really encourage folks to get involved wherever. You can find me at fatrose.org is a good way to find me. There's a website and some contact info there. And yeah, I'm just so grateful to everyone here for all the work that they're putting into all these various projects. And thank you, Tigress, for hosting us. And thank you so much to the ASL interpreters. It's really beautiful to have you here supporting this work.
Thank you all for being here. I will just end by adding to the thanks and reminding our audience that in addition to supporting NAAFA, which obviously we love and enables us to do a lot of things, we do encourage you to look at direct support to our speakers, presenters, and the organizations they represent and the organizations they've mentioned. You can find NoBodyIsDisposable.org. More information about the coalition. And of course, we had 4 representatives here today: Brandy Senziak, Tracy Tidwell, Fady Shanuda, and Max Airborne, but there are many representatives of that organization. And so we thank all of those unnamed folks for their work as well. Thank you once again for Pro Bono ASL, who showed up like champs at a very last minute request to be here with us today, and who we are going to be building an ongoing relationship with. And we encourage you to use their services. Thanks in particular to today's ASL interpreters, Nathanael and Christine. And once again, we thank you for joining us today for the NAAFA webinar series. Our next set of webinars will be part of our Fat Liberation Month. We've got numerous webinars planned for Fat Liberation Month, in addition to other educational and entertaining activities. We also encourage you all to celebrate Fat Liberation Month in your own ways and use the hashtag Fat Liberation Month to show the rest of the world how you are celebrating fat liberation and what that term means to you. Thanks again, everyone. We'll see you next time.